Name the only American general who took a Pacific island away from the Japanese, secured it, walked away a victor, and then crossed to the other side of the world and commanded an entire field army through the heart of Europe, all the way to the front door of Hitler's mountain retreat. You cannot name him, can you? You can name the men who took islands. You can name Vandegrift on Guadalcanal, Holland Smith on Saipan, the Marines on Iwo Jima, and you can name the men who led armies across Europe. Patton with the Third Army, Hodges with the First, Simpson with the Ninth, but name me the one man who did both, the one man who beat the Japanese on a jungle island in the South Pacific, and then beat the Germans across France and into the Alps with an American army under his hand. There is exactly one. And the strange, almost unbelievable thing is that most people who love this history, people who have read every book on the shelf, cannot tell you his name without looking it up. He commanded the corps that finished Guadalcanal, the first ground victory of the entire Pacific War. 2 years later, he was driving up the Rhone Valley with 250,000 men. And by the spring of 1945, his soldiers had taken Nuremberg, taken Munich, and walked into Berchtesgaden itself. No other American general in the war did both of those things, not one. And while he was doing it, his only son was killed in action, fighting in the very same campaign, a few miles from his father's headquarters. And within 6 months of the war ending, the general himself was dead before he could write a single word in his own defense. His name was Alexander McCarroll Patch. And by the time we are done, you are going to understand exactly why a man with the most unusual command record of the entire war became one of the most forgotten generals America ever produced. A lot of you have been asking for the forgotten army commanders, the men who did the work while the famous names took the cameras. And I know some of you had fathers and grandfathers who served in the 7th Army, in the Vosges, in the Colmar Pocket, in that brutal winter on the German frontier. I want to do this one justice. So let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand how this man ended up in 2 wars on 2 oceans, you have to understand where he started. He was born on November the 23rd, 1889, on a frontier army post called Fort Huachuca, in what was then the Arizona Territory. Think about that for a second. He was born on an Indian Wars cavalry post before Arizona was even a state. His father was Captain Alexander Patch, the elder, a West Point man from the class of 1877, a cavalry officer who had chased Apache and been worn down by the frontier service until he retired with his health broken. So the boy grew up in the army before he ever joined it. He grew up around horses, around troopers, around the language of command. The family settled in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, and the son carried the frontier in him for the rest of his life. He went to Lehigh University for a single year, and then he followed his father to West Point. He entered in 1909, and he graduated on June 12, 1913, ranked 75th in a class of 93. Now I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because this audience knows how much the Academy class rank mattered to a man's reputation, and how the Army's Golden Boys were almost always near the top of the list. Patch was not near the top. He was a baseball player and a pole vaulter who scraped through the middle of the pack. He was the kind of cadet the system tends to overlook from the very first day. And in a way, that is the whole story in miniature. The Army would keep overlooking him right up until it needed someone who could actually win. He chose the infantry. The cavalry his father had loved was dying, replaced by the machine gun and the truck, and Patch read the future correctly. He joined the 18th Infantry Regiment, served on the Mexican border, and rode into Mexico in 1916 with the punitive expedition chasing Pancho Villa. He married Julia Littell, the daughter of a brigadier general, in 1915. He was, by every account, a quiet, religious, soft-spoken man who rolled his own cigarettes from a bag of Bull Durham tobacco and could sit and talk with a private as easily as with a colonel. Then came the First War, and the first sign of what this man actually was. He went to France in June of 1917 with the 1st Division, the very first American troops sent to the Western Front. The Army recognized something in him quickly, and they handed him the job of running the American machine gun school at Langres. This matters more than it sounds. The machine gun was the weapon that defined that war, the weapon that had slaughtered a generation, and Patch became one of the men who taught the American Army how to use it. He was an instructor, a doctrine man, an organizer, but he was not content to stay behind the lines. In October of 1918, he took a battalion of his old 18th Infantry into the Meuse-Argonne, the largest battle the United States Army had ever fought, and he led it from the front. His frontline leadership was noticed by a staff officer working for General Pershing, a man named George Catlett Marshall. Remember that name. Marshall never forgot a competent officer, and he never forgot Patch. And here is where the war marked him in a way that would eventually kill him. In the cold and the damp of France, Patch came down with a severe case of pneumonia. His lungs were never the same for the rest of his life. He would be vulnerable to respiratory illness, and disease would shadow every campaign he ever fought. The man who would conquer 2 theaters of war was, physically, a fragile man. I think that is one of the quiet tragedies of his story, and we will come back to it. If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to Patch. Between the wars, he did what forgotten men do. He worked. He spent something close to 11 or 12 years across 3 separate tours teaching military science at the Staunton Military Academy in Virginia. He went through the Command and General Staff School in 1925 and the Army War College in 1932. And he served on the Infantry Board, where he helped design the Triangular Division, the new streamlined American division built around 3 regiments instead of 4. This is the part the popular histories skip entirely. Before Patch ever commanded a battle, he helped build the very structure of the army that would fight the next war. He understood divisions from the inside out, not as a glory seeker, but as an engineer of organizations. In the years right before the war, he commanded the 47th Infantry Regiment in the 9th Division, and his division commander was a Major General named Jacob Devers. Hold on to that relationship, because Devers is going to matter enormously, and not in a good way, when we get to Europe. Patch was promoted to Brigadier General in August of 1941, just before Pearl Harbor, and to Temporary Major General in March of 1942. He was 52 years old, a competent, anonymous, middle-of-the-road officer, the kind of man the Army had 1,000 of. And then the Japanese gave him his chance. The chance was a place called New Caledonia, a French island in the South Pacific that the United States desperately needed to hold to keep the lifeline to Australia open. Patch was sent out to defend it in early 1942, and on the voyage out, true to form, he was stricken with pneumonia again. He arrived sick. But once there, he did something nobody had ordered him to do. He took the scattered, mismatched units that had been dumped on the island, regiments from different states, men who had never trained together, and he welded them into a fighting division. They needed a name. A private first class named David Fonseca suggested combining the words American and New Caledonian, and so was born one of the only American divisions in the entire war to carry a name instead of a number, the Americal Division. Patch built it from nothing, and in late 1942, the Army needed exactly that kind of division for the most desperate ground fight in the Pacific. That fight was Guadalcanal. Most of you know the Marine story of Guadalcanal. You know Vandegrift and the 1st Marine Division landing in August of 1942, holding the airfield they renamed Henderson Field, fighting off banzai charges and naval bombardment, surviving on the edge of starvation while the Navy bled itself white in the waters offshore. That is the famous half of the story, and it deserves to be famous. But here's the part that gets left out. The Marines did not finish Guadalcanal. They could not. They were exhausted, sick, and used up after months of fighting. Somebody had to come in, take command of everything on that island, and actually win the thing. That somebody was Alexander Patch. To understand what Patch walked into, you have to understand how close Guadalcanal had come to disaster. For months the campaign had hung by a thread. The Navy had lost so many ships in the waters off the island that the stretch of sea earned the grim nickname Iron Bottom Sound for the hulls resting on its floor. The Marines ashore had been bombed by night, shelled by battleships, and left short of food and medicine, holding on by sheer stubbornness. Malaria was as dangerous as the enemy. By the time Patch arrived, the worst of the crisis had passed, but the island was not yet won, and somebody had to convert a desperate defense into a finished victory. That is a specific kind of generalship, far less glamorous than the landing, and it is the kind nobody gives medals for in the popular memory. Closing out a hard campaign is grinding, thankless work. It was the first of several times in his career that Patch would be handed exactly that kind of job, and would do it without complaint. On December 9th, 1942, Patch officially relieved Vandegrift in the 1st Marine Division. Think about what that meant. An Army general, a man most of his own service had never heard of, took command of Marines, soldiers, naval aviation, and a multi-service mess of units on a malarial jungle island, and was told to drive the Japanese into the sea. On January 2nd, 1943, the Army activated the 14th Corps and gave it to Patch. Under him, he now had the Americal Division he had built himself, the 25th Infantry Division, and the 2nd Marine Division. According to the United States Army official history, the Green Book titled Guadalcanal, the First Offensive by John Miller, Jr., The Allied forces in the Guadalcanal area numbered about 50,000 men by the 7th of January. His 3 divisions together came to more than 40,000 men, facing fewer than 25,000 Japanese of the 17th Army, men who were by then starving, riddled with disease, and cut off from resupply. But do not mistake a weakened enemy for an easy fight. The Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal did not surrender. He dug in on ground with names the survivors never forgot: Mount Austin, the Gifu Strong Point, the Galloping Horse, the Seahorse. Patch launched his corps offensive on January 10, 1943, and he fought it the way a doctrine man fights, methodically, with artillery and coordination and patience, grinding through fortified ridgelines and jungle heat. And here is a number that tells you everything about how he fought. In the January attacks, the 27th Infantry Regiment, doing some of the hardest work, lost 7 officers and 67 enlisted men killed, with 226 wounded. That is according to the Army Green Book. Those are real losses, and every one of them was a man. But compared to the slaughter the Marines had endured, and compared to what frontal assaults cost elsewhere in the Pacific, Patch was spending his soldiers' lives carefully. I believe that is the mark of the man. He was never cheap with the enemy and never careless with his own. I want to give you one piece of operational detail here, because it is the kind of thing that separates a real commander from a name on a map. The single hardest position on Guadalcanal was a fortified horseshoe the Japanese had dug into the high ground near Mount Austin, a maze of mutually supporting log and earth bunkers the Americans called the Gifu, after the home prefecture of some of its defenders. Artillery bounced off it. Rifle fire did nothing. A commander in a hurry, a commander hunting headlines, would have thrown wave after wave of infantry straight at it and called the bill the cost of doing business. Patch did not. He had the position sealed off and reduced deliberately, brought a light tank up the ridge to crack the bunkers one at a time, and refused to trade his soldiers' lives for speed he did not need. The Gifu finally fell in the last week of January. That kind of patience is invisible in the history books, because patience does not photograph well, but it is exactly why his casualty lists stayed shorter than they had any right to be. And consider the thing that almost no other general in the war had to do. Patch was an Army officer commanding Marines, with Navy aviation flying overhead, and a supply line stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. The services did not always love one another. The rivalry between the Army and the Marine Corps in the Pacific was real, and sometimes it turned poisonous. You will see it explode later in the war at Saipan, where an Army general and a Marine general nearly went to open warfare with each other over the relief of a division. Patch handled the same combustible mix on Guadalcanal, and you almost never hear a word of complaint about it, because he simply was not interested in which service got the glory. He was interested in clearing the island. That, again, is the man. He treated a coalition of rival services the way he treated everything else in his life, as a job to be done quietly and done well. By the first week of February, the Japanese did something almost unheard of. They evacuated. Under cover of darkness, they slipped thousands of their surviving men off the island by destroyer, and Patch's forces closed the trap on empty positions. On February 9th, 1943, Guadalcanal was declared secure. The first major ground offensive of the entire Pacific War was over, and it was an American victory, and the man who finished it was Alexander Patch. Now, the casualty figures for the whole campaign vary depending on what you count, and I want to be honest with you about that, because this audience checks. If you count only the ground fighting, the Joint American Ground Forces lost roughly 1,592 men killed and about 4,183 wounded, according to the National World War II Museum. If you count the entire 6-month campaign, including the naval battles offshore, the Naval History and Heritage Command puts American dead at around 7,100 with nearly 8,000 wounded. Japanese losses were catastrophic. The Naval History and Heritage Command states at least 19,200 Japanese dead. Other estimates run higher, with thousands more dead of disease and starvation, and around 1,000 taken prisoner. Whatever number you settle on, the meaning is the same. The Japanese army was beaten on the ground for the first time in the war, and it never got the initiative back. For this, Patch received both the Army Distinguished Service Medal and the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, a rare double honor that reflected the joint nature of what he had pulled off. But the jungle had taken its toll. He was racked by pneumonia, malaria, and dysentery. Marshall, who never lost track of him, pulled him home in May of 1943 to recover and to command the 4th Corps at Fort Lewis, where that autumn he ran the Oregon Maneuver, a training exercise involving around 100,000 men. He had won a campaign that made headlines. And then, in classic Patch fashion, he disappeared back into the machinery of the Army, training divisions while other men got the magazine covers. And here is where it could have ended. A solid Pacific record, a corps command, a quiet path to retirement. But the Army had one more enormous job for him on the other side of the world. In March of 1944, Patch was given command of the 7th Army and sent to the Mediterranean to plan one of the largest amphibious invasions of the entire war. The operation was first called Anvil and then renamed Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. He took over the army from Mark Clark, a man whose hunger for publicity was the exact opposite of Patch's temperament, and I think the contrast is worth sitting with. Clark would go on to be remembered, fairly or not, as one of the great self-promoters of the war. Patch took the same army and made himself invisible. On August 7, 1944, he was promoted to lieutenant general. 8 days later, his army hit the beaches of the French Riviera, and here is a piece of context that makes what Patch pulled off even more impressive. The invasion he was about to command had been fought over bitterly at the highest levels of the alliance, and not by the enemy. Winston Churchill had opposed Operation Dragoon almost to the end. He wanted those divisions used in Italy or thrown into the Balkans, and he argued against the southern France landing right up until the last weeks, reportedly grumbling that the very code name had been chosen because he felt dragooned into the whole thing. So Patch inherited an operation the British Prime Minister thought was a strategic mistake, planned it under that cloud, and then executed it so cleanly that even the skeptics fell silent. Eisenhower himself said afterward that there was no development of that summer of 1944 that added more decisively to the Allied advantage than the attack coming up the Rhone Valley. The Supreme Commander considered Patch's campaign one of the most decisive strokes of the year. Hold that thought, because it makes what the same man would later write about Patch very hard to explain. This is the part the official histories gloss over because it does not fit the Normandy story everyone already knows. On August 15th, 1944, the 7th Army landed in southern France. The 6th Corps, under Major General Lucien Truscott, went ashore with the 3rd, the 36th, and the 45th Infantry Divisions, followed by powerful French forces under General de Lattre de Tassigny. And it went almost perfectly. According to the National World War II Museum, the landings put roughly 94,000 men ashore on the first day for the loss of just 395 casualties. Let me say that again, because it is staggering. The most successful amphibious assault of the war in terms of cost was not Normandy. It was Patch's invasion of southern France. Eventually, around 250,000 American and French ground troops came ashore through his beachhead. And then Patch did what almost no Allied commander managed to do in 1944. He moved fast. The German Army Group G in southern France numbered something like 210,000 men, but they were mostly second-rate divisions with only a single panzer division among them, and they were in danger of being cut off entirely by the landings. Patch sent his army racing up the Rhone Valley in pursuit, and the pace was relentless. By the 9th to the 11th of September, his forward elements linked up with Patton's 3rd Army, coming from Normandy near Dijon, sealing off the south of France. According to Keith Bond, in his essay on Patch for the George Marshall Foundation, the 7th Army captured more than 88,000 Germans of Army Group G during that pursuit. To put that in perspective, that haul of prisoners rivaled or exceeded the famous bag taken at Falaise. But you have heard of Falaise. You have probably never heard of the Rhone pursuit. That, right there, is the pattern of this man's entire career. But that was just the beginning of the hard part, because once you reach the German frontier, the easy ground runs out. In mid-September of 1944, Patch's 7th Army came under a new headquarters, the 6th Army Group, commanded by his old peacetime division commander, Jacob Devers. The French forces were organized into the French 1st Army, and Devers now controlled an army group of something like 350,000 troops. I want to flag this command relationship clearly, because it becomes the key to the whole mystery of why Patch was forgotten. Devers was a capable, energetic officer. He was also a man that Dwight Eisenhower personally did not like and did not trust, and that dislike would eventually fall like a shadow across everyone who served under Devers, including Patch. The competence of the subordinate could not outrun the politics above him. Keep that in mind. Ahead of the 7th Army lay the Vosges Mountains, and the High Vosges in particular. Keith Bond makes a remarkable claim in his Marshall Foundation essay, and it has stuck with me. In all of recorded military history, no attacking army had ever successfully forced its way through the High Vosges. Not the Romans, not anyone. Patch's 7th Army did it in the freezing autumn and winter of 1944 against a determined German defense in some of the worst terrain and weather imaginable. They broke the German winter line, seized the Severn Gap, and on November 23, 1944, reached the Rhine at Strasbourg. And here's a statistic that I think defines Patch as a battlefield commander. According to Bonn, during that autumn offensive, the 7th Army inflicted more than 24% more casualties on the Germans than it suffered itself. That is a remarkable ratio for any army, and it is almost unheard of for an army on the attack, in the mountains in winter. The man knew how to fight without throwing his soldiers away. I told you the 7th Army reached the Rhine at Strasbourg. Let me tell you how, because it deserves more than half a sentence. Picture the Vosges as steep, forested ridges marching one behind another in freezing rain and the first snow. Every road a defile the Germans could block, every hilltop its own fortress. There were no clean breakthroughs to be had, no open tank country like the dash across France had been. It was a soldier's fight, won by infantry climbing through wet timber a ridge at a time. And the climax of it was one of the great moments of the war that almost nobody outside France remembers. Patch turned loose the French 2nd Armored Division under General Jacques Leclerc, the same division that had liberated Paris. And on November 23, 1944, Leclerc's tanks burst through the Severn Gap and drove straight into Strasbourg, the capital of Alsace, a city that had been under the German flag since the fall of France. Years earlier, in the African desert, those Frenchmen had sworn an oath, the oath of Kufra, that they would not rest until their own flag flew again over Strasbourg Cathedral. Under Patch's command, they kept that oath. It is one of the most emotionally charged moments of the entire liberation, and it happened in the army that history forgot. Something else happened at that river in late November of 1944, and I think it is the hidden hinge of this whole story. When the 7th Army and the 6th Army Group reached the Rhine, Devers wanted to cross it at once, right there in the south, while the Germans in front of him were still reeling. His troops had located a feasible crossing site near Rastatt, a bridgehead over the Rhine in late 1944, months before the famous capture of the bridge at Rimingen, might have torn open the entire German defense of the West. Eisenhower said no. He ordered Devers to turn north and clear the West Bank instead, and the chance was gone. Historians have argued about that decision ever since. Some defend Eisenhower's caution. Others, and I lean this way myself, see it as a moment where the Supreme Commander's distrust of Devers may have cost the Allies a genuine opportunity. But here is the point for our story. Patch was the Army commander whose men would have made that crossing. The boldest stroke available on the entire Western Front that autumn was sitting in his sector, and it was vetoed for reasons that had as much to do with personalities at headquarters as with the situation on the ground. When the politics at the top decided what Patch's army was allowed to attempt, competence on the ground did not get a vote. It is worth pausing on how Patch actually ran an army, because his method was the opposite of the famous men's. He did not command by spectacle. He commanded by trust. He picked good corps commanders, Lucian Truscott chief among them, and then he let them fight their corps without breathing down their necks. He went forward to see the ground himself, often closer to the front than an army commander was supposed to be, and then he went quiet and let the professionals do their work. There were no theatrical visits staged for photographers, no carefully rehearsed catchphrases, no diary written with one eye on posterity. A general who commands that way produces results that are very hard to pin on him personally, and that, it turns out, is a real problem. When everything goes right and the commander never reaches for the credit drifts to the units, to the moment, to anyone but him. Patch built a machine so smooth that his own fingerprints disappeared from it. I think he knew that, and I think he did not care, and I think that is rarer and finer than almost anything Patton ever growled into a microphone. And then it got worse, because as the year turned, the Germans launched their last great gamble in the West. You all know about the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes, where the Germans struck Bradley's forces in December of 1944. What far fewer people know is that there was a second German offensive aimed straight at Patch. It was called Operation Nordwind, and it hit the 7th Army on the last night of December 1944, when Patch's forces had been stretched thin to cover for the crisis in the Ardennes to the north. Patch's intelligence officer, Colonel William Quinn, had read the signs and predicted the blow, and the 7th Army held. Through January of 1945, in bitter cold, Patch's men absorbed and defeated the last German offensive of the war in the West. At the same time, his forces in the French First Army ground down the Colmar Pocket, the last German bridgehead west of the Rhine in Alsace. That fight was savage. The casualty compilations for the Colmar Pocket put American losses around 8,000 and French losses around 14,000, with German losses running into the tens of thousands. By the 25th of January, 1945, the Germans had been thrown back across the Rhine, and Patch had defended the southern shoulder of the entire Western Front through the worst winter of the war. There is one more piece of the Nordwind crisis worth telling because it shows the kind of pressure Patch was working under. As the German offensive developed, Eisenhower's headquarters initially wanted the 7th Army to give ground, and even to pull back from Strasbourg, the great Alsatian city Patch's men had liberated only weeks before in order to shorten and strengthen the Allied line. On a map, it made perfect sense. To the French, it was unthinkable because abandoning Strasbourg meant handing its people back to the Germans, and almost certainly to reprisals. Charles de Gaulle protested furiously and threatened to pull the French army out of the Allied chain of command altogether. The crisis went all the way to the top, and in the end, Strasbourg was held. Patch's army was the instrument that held it. Once again, the great decisions swirled above his head. The politics belonged to other men. The job of actually making it work on frozen ground in the dead of winter belonged to him. Now I want to slow down here, because while Patch was commanding an army through this nightmare, something happened to him personally that I think you have to know in order to understand the man. And this is the part of the research that stopped me cold when I read it. Patch had a son, his only son, Captain Alexander McCarroll. Patch III called Mac, a West Point man from the class of 1942, just like his father and his grandfather before him. 3 generations of West Point. Mac commanded a company in the 315th Infantry Regiment of the 79th Infantry Division. And that division was fighting in eastern France in the autumn of 1944, in the same theater, under the same army group, a short distance from where his father commanded the 7th Army. In late August of 1944, Mac had been shot in the shoulder leading an attack, and he kept leading it for 2 more hours before he would let anyone treat him. Then, on October 22, 1944, in the fighting near the forest of Paroy, Captain Mac Patch was killed in action, leading his men against entrenched German positions. He was 23 years old. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and the Purple Heart. Rick Atkinson, whose Liberation trilogy is the closest thing this period has to a definitive narrative history, said in an interview with the National World War II Museum that the death of Sandy Patch's son still sears him. Atkinson tells the story through the general's own letters to his wife, and he said that even while continuing to do his duty as the 7th Army commander, Patch never got over it. Think about what that means. This man buried his only son at the Epinal American Cemetery in France, and then he turned around and went back to commanding 200,000 other men's sons in the worst winter of the war. He could not stop. The army does not stop for one man's grief, not even a general's. I have read a great deal of military history, and I will tell you plainly, that is one of the heaviest things I have ever come across. The father and the son in the same campaign, and only one of them came home. There is a detail in the record that I cannot get out of my head. Patch went to the cemetery at Epinal in eastern France, and he buried his boy himself, and then he got back in the vehicle and returned to his headquarters and went on running the war. He had 250,000 other men to think about, a German army still in front of him, and a winter bearing down. Whatever he felt, he carried it in private, in letters to his wife that historians like Rick Atkinson would only read decades later. He did not let it show to the army. I have tried to imagine the discipline that takes, and I cannot fully do it. To bury your only child and then walk back into the command post and pick up the map again, there is a kind of strength there that has no medal for it, and I think it is the truest measure of the man, more than Guadalcanal, more than Strasbourg, more than any of it. And if this sounds familiar to some of you, if you have watched a man keep showing up to do the job while carrying something that would break most people, you already understand Patch better than the history books ever let on. He kept fighting. In March of 1945, the 7th Army launched Operation Undertone and crossed the Rhine near Worms. From there, the advance became a flood. Aschaffenburg fell in early April after a fanatical defense, then Würzburg, then Bamberg on the 13th of April, and then came the symbolic prizes. On April 20th, 1945, after days of house-to-house fighting, the 7th Army captured Nuremberg, the city of the Nazi Party rallies, the place whose very name had become shorthand for the regime. There is something fitting about Patch's quiet, anonymous army being the one to take the stage where Hitler had performed his power. On April 30th, the day Hitler killed himself in Berlin, Patch's men captured Munich, the birthplace of the Nazi movement. And in the first days of May, the 7th Army's 15th Corps captured Berchtesgaden itself, the mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps where Hitler had built his eagle's nest. Patch's soldiers had walked all the way from the beaches of the Riviera to the dictator's own back porch. At the same time, elements of his 6th Corps pushed into Austria and met the 5th Army coming up from Italy near the Brenner Pass, physically linking the European and Mediterranean theaters of the war. There is one more thing the 7th Army did in those final days that has to be said plainly because it is the heaviest weight in the entire record. On April 29th, 1945, soldiers of Patch's 7th Army reached the gates of the concentration camp at Dachau. What they found there, the boxcars of the dead, the survivors who were barely still alive, became one of the things that generation of Americans carried in silence for the rest of their lives. I'm not going to dwell on the details, out of respect for what those men saw and what was done to the people they found. But I will say this. The men who opened that camp were Patch's men, and the army that walked from the beaches of the Riviera all the way to the gates of Dachau and on to the Dictator's Mountain was commanded by a man whose name almost no one can recall today. If ever an army earned its place in the national memory, it was this one. And still it slipped away into the footnotes. Let me give you the scale of what this army did, because the numbers deserve to be stated plainly. In less than 9 months of continuous fighting, the 7th Army advanced more than 1,000 miles from the Mediterranean coast to the Austrian Alps. At various times, Patch commanded as many as 24 American and Allied divisions under that single Army headquarters. He landed his army at the lowest cost of any major amphibious operation of the war. He forced the High Vosges, which no attacker in history had ever done. He defeated the last German offensive in the West. And, through all of it, he kept his casualties lower than the punishment he handed the enemy. By any honest accounting of generalship, that is one of the finest Army-level records of the entire war. So why have you never heard of him? This is the heart of it. This is the question I cannot let go of. And the answer is not that he was secretly mediocre, because he was not. The answer is that the system that decides which generals are remembered runs on something other than competence. It runs on visibility, on self-promotion, on whose boss had the ear of the boss above him. And Alexander Patch failed every one of those tests, on purpose. Start with the man's own personality. He despised publicity. When his portrait ran on the cover of Time magazine, the issue dated August 28, 1944, in the glow of his triumph in southern France, Patch did not even bother to read the story inside about himself. According to Atkinson, as quoted in the Washington Post review of The Guns at Last Light, Patch wrote to his wife in September of 1944 that, in his words, this temporary notoriety would soon die out. He was right. He made sure of it. While Patton was crafting his image with pearl-handled pistols and quotable profanity, while Montgomery was holding press conferences, while MacArthur was choreographing his every photograph, Patch was rolling cigarettes from a bag of tobacco and refusing to talk about himself. In an army where reputation was currency, he simply declined to spend any. But personality alone does not bury a man this completely. The system buried him too, and we can name the specific ways. Here is the first one, and it is documented. When Eisenhower wrote his official post-war report of operations, a document of about 180 pages summarizing the campaign in the West, he gave Patch's 7th Army a grand total of 8 pages. 8 pages out of 180 for an army that had invaded southern France, forced the Vosges, and taken Nuremberg, Munich, and Berchtesgaden. Keith Bond, in his Marshall Foundation essay, calls it what it plainly was, an obvious snub. And Bond ties it directly to the second cause. Eisenhower's well-documented dislike of Jacob Devers, the man who commanded the 6th Army group that Patch served under. The politics that swirled around Devers, the friction over the crossing of the Rhine at Rastatt, the personality clash at the top, all of it settled downward and dimmed the reputation of every general underneath Devers, including the one who least deserved it. Here's the third documented insult, and this one tells you everything about who Patch was. When the campaign credits for the war were being assigned, his men, the soldiers who had defeated Operation Nordwind in Alsace, were initially folded into the Ardennes credit, the credit for the Battle of the Bulge that they had not even fought in. Patch fought to fix it. He went over Eisenhower's head, directly to Marshall, to demand that his soldiers get the campaign credit they had earned for their own battle, and he won. The credit was officially changed to Ardennes Alsace, so that the men of the 7th Army would carry on their records what they had actually done. But here is the bitter part. By the time the change became official, most of those soldiers had already been demobilized and sent home. He fought the system for his men, and he won the principle, and the men had already gone. That, to me, is the truest single act of his career. He spent his own dwindling capital not on his own fame, but on a battle streamer for soldiers who would mostly never know he had fought for it. Now I have to be careful and honest with you about one more thing, because this audience does not tolerate sloppy claims, and there's a documented detail here that is easy to get wrong. There's a famous list, an order of merit, where Eisenhower ranked his top generals. The list Eisenhower compiled on the 1st of February 1945, recorded in Harry Butcher's diary, My 3 Years with Eisenhower, and cited by Carlo d'Este in his biography, Eisenhower, A Soldier's Life, placed Patch around 9th among the more than 30 senior generals Eisenhower rated. And critically, that put Patch ahead of his own boss, Devers, who landed down around 24th. Bond notes that Eisenhower ranked the value of Patch's services ahead of Hodges and ahead of Simpson, two Army commanders whose names you are far more likely to recognize. Now I have seen people confuse this with a different list, one that Bradley submitted on the 1st of December, 1944, which is reproduced in Russell Weigley's book Eisenhower's Lieutenants, where Patch sits around 15th. Those are two separate documents from two different men, and they should not be blended together. But on either list, the conclusion is the same, and it is remarkable. The senior leadership of the United States Army, in private, rated Patch above generals who became household names. They knew exactly how good he was. They simply never told the public, and the public never had a reason to learn. Listen to how the men who actually served with him talked about him, because this is where the record gets personal. Lucian Truscott, his own corps commander, no soft touch and no flatterer, wrote that he came to regard Patch as a man of outstanding integrity, a courageous and competent leader, and an unselfish comrade in arms. A senior 7th Army staff officer, quoted by Bond, said that Patch cared for his soldiers more than any other commander he had known, and called him lovable, kind, a modest man, and then said simply, "I love that man." Barry Goldwater, the future senator, said he would have given his right arm to serve under Patch. These are not the words men use about a forgettable general. These are the words men use about someone they would have followed anywhere. The affection was real. The respect was real. It just never made it into the textbooks because affection and respect among soldiers do not sell magazines the way pearl-handled pistols do. And here is the cruelest turn of all, the one that sealed his obscurity for good. Alexander Patch did not get to grow old and tell his story. He did not get to write the memoir that every famous general wrote, the book that shaped how history would remember him. The pneumonia he first caught in France in 1918, the disease that had stalked him through New Caledonia and Guadalcanal, finally caught up with him. On November 21st, 1945, just 2 days short of his 56th birthday, only about 6 months after the war in Europe ended, Alexander Patch died of pneumonia at Brooke General Hospital at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. He was buried at West Point. Think about what the timing did to his legacy. Patton died that same December. But Patton had already become a legend, already built his myth, already lived in the public imagination. Patch died before the public ever learned who he was. He left no memoir. He left no carefully managed reputation. He left a grieving widow who had now lost both a son and a husband to the same war within 13 months of each other. In 1954, 9 years after his death, Congress posthumously promoted him to full 4-star general, the rank his record had earned. But by then, almost nobody remembered the name they were honoring. There are a few monuments to him if you know where to look. A Navy troopship was named for him, the General Alexander Patch, and it carried American soldiers across the Atlantic for years after the war. And the headquarters of United States European Command, in Stuttgart, in Germany, sits on a post called Patch Barracks, named in his honor. Think about the quiet irony of that. The nerve center of American military power on the European continent, the command that has anchored the Western Alliance for generations, bears the name of Alexander Patch. And I would wager that most of the soldiers who report for duty there every single morning could not tell you one true thing about the man on the sign. He is remembered exactly the way he lived, present, essential, and almost completely invisible. Let me lay the comparative numbers out plainly, the way this story deserves, because the contrast between the record and the reputation is the entire point. He was the only American general to command a victorious campaign on a Pacific island and then command an army in Europe. His amphibious invasion of southern France cost 395 casualties on the first day to land 94,000 men, the most efficient major landing of the war. He bagged more than 88,000 German prisoners in the Rhone pursuit. He forced the High Vosges, which no army in recorded history had done before. His 7th Army inflicted 24% more casualties than it took during the autumn offensive. He advanced more than 1,000 miles in under 9 months and commanded as many as 24 divisions. He took Nuremberg, Munich, and Berchtesgaden. Eisenhower privately ranked him around 9th out of more than 30 top generals, ahead of 2 famous army commanders and ahead of his own boss. and he got 8 pages out of 180 in Eisenhower's report, no memoir, and an early grave. I want to be precise about that opening claim because I know some of you are already reaching for the comments, and you are right to. Was Patch truly the only American general to do both? Here is the honest answer, and the honest answer is actually more interesting than the slogan. A handful of American generals did fight in both theaters. Major General Charles Corlett, nicknamed Cowboy Pete, won the Pacific island of Kwajalein and then commanded a corps in Europe. J. Lawton Collins, called Lightning Joe, fought on Guadalcanal and then commanded the 7th Corps from Normandy to the Elbe. But notice the level. Corlett and Collins commanded corps in Europe, not armies. Patch is the only one who won a Pacific Island campaign and then commanded a full field army in Europe. And here is one more wrinkle this audience will appreciate. Patch and Lucian Truscott were the only 2 United States Army officers in the entire war to command, in turn, a division, a corps, and a field army. But Truscott's army was the 5th Army in Italy, in the Mediterranean, and Truscott never finished a Pacific Island campaign. So when you put it precisely, the Pacific Island victory plus the European Field Army, Patch stands completely alone. The slogan holds. It just needs the footnote, and I would rather give you the footnote than insult your intelligence. And think about his actual peers, the other American Field Army commanders in Europe. Omar Bradley, who rose to command an army group, wore 5 stars and became a household name. George Patton, whose legend needs no introduction from me. Courtney Hodges of the 1st Army. William Simpson of the 9th. Every one of those men is far better remembered than Patch. Not a single one of them carried a Pacific Island victory on his record before he ever set foot in Europe. Patch did the rarest thing in the entire American officer corps. He won at the highest tactical level in both of the great theaters of the war, on opposite sides of the planet, and then he finished dead last in fame among the Army commanders he stood shoulder to shoulder with. The gap between what he did and how he is remembered is, as far as I have been able to find, the widest such gap of any senior American commander of the entire war. That gap is the reason this video exists. So what does all of this finally tell us? Not just about one forgotten general, but about the system that forgot him. In my view, the story of Alexander Patch is the clearest case I know of a simple, uncomfortable truth about institutions. The skills that make a man excellent at the actual job are not the same skills that make him famous for it, and the institution rewards the second set far more reliably than the first. Patch was superb at the work. He built divisions. He won campaigns on 2 oceans. He kept his soldiers alive at a better rate than almost any peer, and he gave the credit to everyone but himself. And the Army's machinery of memory, the reports, the press, the memoirs, the rankings that get leaked and the rankings that stay buried, ran right past him because he refused to feed it. He would not promote himself. He served under a boss the Supreme Commander disliked, and he died before he could correct the record. 3 strikes, none of them about whether he could fight, all of them about politics and visibility and luck. Consider how the famous reputations were actually built, because once you see the machinery, you cannot unsee it. After the war, the memoirs came, one after another, and each one shaped how history would remember its author. Eisenhower wrote Crusade in Europe. Bradley wrote A Soldier's Story. Montgomery wrote his memoirs. Patton's wartime writings were published as War as I Knew It. Mark Clark wrote Calculated Risk. Each of those books put its author at the dead center of the story and arranged the supporting cast around him. Popular history leans heavily on first-hand accounts like these, because they are vivid and because they are there on the shelf. So ask yourself a simple question. Where is the Patch memoir? There is none. He died in November of 1945, before the memoir era had even begun. He never got to put himself at the center of anything. So when the historians sat down to write the story of the war in the West, the seat where Patch's own voice should have been was simply empty, and the narrative flowed around the gap as if he had never been there at all. The man did not lose the argument over his own legacy. He never got to make it. I do not think this was a conspiracy. Nobody sat in a room and decided to erase Alexander Patch. It is worse than that, in a way. It was simply the ordinary working of a system that quietly confuses being known with being good. The system did not hate Patch. It just had no slot for a man who did the work and then went silent. And if that pattern sounds familiar, if you have spent a career watching the person who quietly does the work get passed over, while the person who manages upward and works the room collects the promotion, you are not imagining it, and you are not alone. The pattern is older than any of us. Patch lived the purest version of it I have ever found, in olive drab on 2 oceans. And the men best at the actual fighting, in my experience reading this history again and again, were so often exactly the men worst at navigating the hierarchy that decided whose name would last. The hierarchy did not punish Patch the way it punished Terry Allen with an outright firing. It did something quieter and almost more complete. It let him win everything, and then it let him be forgotten. There's a final number I keep coming back to, and it is not a casualty figure or a count of prisoners. It is the number 2. 2 members of one family, a father and a son, 3 generations of West Point between them, both gave the same war everything they had. The son gave his life on a French hillside in October of 1944. The father gave his health, his son, and finally his own life, dead of the lungs the first war had ruined, before the second war's dust had even settled. And in return, the country he served gave him 8 pages and a name almost nobody can recall. Alexander McCarroll Patch, the only American general to win a Pacific island and then command an army across Europe, the man who took Guadalcanal and Berchtesgaden both. The man Eisenhower privately ranked above generals you have heard of and then buried in a report. Remember the name now, because the men who served under him never forgot it, and neither should we. If your father or grandfather served in the 7th Army, in the Americal Division on Guadalcanal, in the landings in southern France, in the Vosges, or in the Colmar Pocket, I would like to hear about it. Those stories matter, and there are fewer people left every year who can tell them. Drop them in the comments. I read them all, and so do a lot of the people watching this. That is the story. The sources are in the description. I will see you in the next one.